what usually we would ask someone is, hey, we can send a reset password link to your contact point. And then what we find in some of these cases is it's hard to give support because the people say, oh, but I don't even have that number anymore. And that's an old email I don't have access to anymore. So it sort of really reduces the breadth of how someone can actually prove their identity. And that's where we may get into things like selfie captcha, where we ask someone to actually take a photo. We want to try compare and ensure that this is actually the person who's represented by the profile.
You are listening to The Secure Developer, where we speak to leaders and experts about DevSecOps, Dev and Sec collaboration, cloud security, and much more. The podcast is part of the DevSecCon community, found on DevSecCon.com, where you can find incredible dev and security resources and discuss them with other smart and kind community members. This podcast is sponsored by Snyk. Snyk's developer security platform helps developers build secure applications without slowing down, fixing vulnerabilities in code, open source containers, and infrastructure as code. To learn more, visit snyk.io/TSD.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to The Secure Developer. Today, we have a very special guest, Guy Rosen, who we'll kind of describe in a second. And I go way, way back, probably over 20 years here. It's a pleasure to sort of have him here on the show. And while we both took, various sort of zigs and zags for our careers on it, I think we both have started in security, have left security and gotten back into it, bringing some different perspectives into it. And it's really, really kind of fun to have you on the show here, Guy, and hear a little bit of the learnings from your journey. So I'll get to the bio, but first, let me say thanks for coming onto the show, Guy.
Thank you for having me, Guy.
So let's start by introducing you, Guy, to the audience. So Guy Rosen is Meta's Chief Information Security Officer, or CISO. And as its CISO, Guy oversees, on one hand, the safety side and combating sort of on-platform abuse and all of that jazz, and security, protecting kind of the security of the system itself, the product, the infrastructure, the company information, and has been doing it for a while, has a couple of decades of cybersecurity, software development, product management experience coming into this role. He joined Meta in 2013 when they acquired Onavo, which he was the co-founder and CEO of, and since 2017 has been leading an overhaul of Meta's approach to fighting abuse on the platform, and has built an industry-leading integrity team that pioneered all sorts of approaches to complex challenges, such as harmful content, election readiness, and adversarial threats. So an easy job, all in all, Guy, no? Like that.
Yeah. You might say I have a thing or two that keep me up at night. That's the kind of work I like to do. All of us on security love these kind of things.
Indeed. There's like a million topics I can ask you about, but I figured we'll focus on some things that you have a very kind of unique perspective on as Meta CISO. And maybe the first one is indeed from that bio, this notion of the combination of security and safety. Those two are not entirely rare to sort of see them in the same role, but it's also not obvious that they come in. How do you think about this combination of keeping the platform secure and maybe the users safe on it? How do they combine into one role?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And even at Meta, they weren't together until roughly last year when I took on the more traditional information securities or cybersecurity team. For context, I've been doing what we today call integrity, which is sort of the trust and safety work, for just over 6 years, so since 2017. And it's definitely an area that's very adjacent to a lot of what the industry does around cybersecurity, but indeed with a platform of scale and on a user-generated content platform where you have these kind of potential issues and you need to define your policies. It's a different and almost a new kind of profession that has really grown in the past, sort of the past 6, 7, 8 years or so. The way we think about it, so what we call internally, we call this integrity for a bunch of historical reasons. It's fighting abuse on the platform. And that means everything from starting from what are the policies you have? What kind of content or behaviors or actors do you want or not want on the platform? And then how do you enforce them? How do you think about that through a lens of technology and also people? Because a lot of it has to be human driven. You need to have a lot of the context and the nuance that at the end of the day, humans are able to provide. AI has been an amazing tool to help scale that, but ultimately it's really about scaling humans is a lot of how we think about it. You also need to think about the impact of mistakes you make. a big part of our job, and I see a lot of interesting analogs in the security space too, is we're not just here to enforce the policies, we're also here to make sure that we are leaving the right things up. So it's not just about taking content down, because ultimately we built a platform that people come to express themselves. And it's too easy to just take a lot of things down because maybe you can block it all. Maybe they might violate something, but you need to have a really high bar and make sure that even things that many people are going to find offensive or objectionable or disagree with, you want to give room for that, because that's ultimately sort of the mission we have here. And if you think about that from an engineering lens, it translates into things like precision and recall, which there is no perfect precision and perfect recall. There are going to be trade-offs. There is not going to be a perfect outcome here. And so understanding and talking about what those trade-offs are is a big part of how we think about this work. So that's sort of the integrity side of it. And then last year I took on the security team, which indeed is going to be something that's more familiar, I'm sure, to many listeners, or risks to confidentiality, integrity, availability. And we think about this at Meta across all of our products, across our infrastructure, across our corporate systems, and the more traditional things, thinking about vulnerabilities, about incident response, about risk and compliance type work. And there's definitely a Venn diagram between these two. And you see it in a few areas such as account compromise. You see it in areas such as we have a lot of work on coordinated inauthentic behavior. This is the pioneering work we've been doing in the last, I'd say, 6 years or so across so-called information operations, understanding how sophisticated adversaries are trying to use these kind of platforms to, spread misinformation or spread their narratives, wherever they might be, in an inauthentic way. And this is really an area which sits the heart of the intersection between some of these areas, because you need to think about it from an adversarial security type mindset, but also from a content type mindset of what are the policies, how do you define them, what happens when authentic actors spread inauthentic messages, how do you sort of mix and sort through a lot of those? Those are the kind of challenges that you have to face.
Yes. If I echo this back, and it's sort of a fascinating combo here. So like one sort of thread in common is the adversary, is the fact that there is a villain, right? There is someone trying to abuse the system. And it sounds like another is also this sort of separation between kind of a pattern of attack. This is like legitimate normal use. This is how people typically use the system, whether it's for security or for sort of safety or integrity violations. Either way, you kind of need to, I guess, establish the norm so that you can identify deviation from the norm and then kind of spot the deviations from it. Like, is it too analogous? Did I get that correctly? Or
one interesting thing is, I think in security space, there's much more of a clear sort of bad actor adversary. In the integrity space, sometimes there could be a spammer, could be a nation state adversary, a hacker of some kind. But also integrity needs to think about regular people who unintentionally run into policies, maybe writing something in the heat of the moment that ends up crossing our policies, sharing something they didn't realize. And there's different sort of archetypes of how and why people do that. And many of them are well-meaning and didn't realize and just, they just need it to be explained. Hey, this actually violates our policies. We'll take it down. And so understanding how you build user experiences at scale, which help to educate, help to provide that kind of notice to people, and also give them the ability to tell us, hey, you guys are wrong, so that we can go and fix it. That's a really important part of it, which is, I would say, less traditional part of the sort of a traditional cybersecurity role.
Yeah.
But there are the areas where there is an adversary, where there is someone, for example, trying to spread spam, and they might do it through fake accounts they're creating. They might do it by trying to compromise accounts, and some of these guys can be very sophisticated. And so those are the kinds of areas where we're going to find overlap between the areas, and indeed areas where these teams, I find, work together a lot in order to try to fight some of these kind of phenomena that are out there and targeting obviously many platforms, but something that we think about a lot.
Do they sort of technologically or organizationally, in terms of people, like, are these sort of two things that roll up to you, but they're sort of fairly independent, or is there a lot of cross-pollination of sort of skills or technology that spans the more traditional security and sort of the safety integrity aspect of it?
So there's separate teams that sort of roll up to me. There is a bunch of overlap, a lot of close collaboration, a lot of ways we both want to think about how we show up externally, because at the end of the day, an adversary is an adversary. You don't want to ship your org chart to an adversary and have them find the vulnerabilities that fell through the cracks between multiple teams.
Yeah.
The same goes internally when we work with different product teams at the company. And they want to make sure that they're bringing the best products to market and they're thinking about safety and security as they build their products. We also don't want to show up as multiple separate teams. So those are the kind of things we think about to make sure that we're thinking through these in kind of comprehensive and holistic manner as we work with anyone that's not sort of in our bubble.
I think that makes sense. And you mentioned, I guess, account takeover is a specific example of that. I don't know if I can kind of ask for a bit more sort of like, what does that picture look like as an example of places where the two maybe touch one another a bit more?
Yeah, if you think about account takeover, that's an area that definitely sits in the overlap between the teams. So on one hand, you have the integrity team thinks mostly about a lot of the at-scale user experiences for people who are trying to log in and perhaps detecting that there's something fishy or something wrong with where they're logging into. We use a lot of AI to obviously try to understand where, are there any patterns that are suspicious and put people into checkpoints. And again, it's an example of where we need to build those products with billions of people in mind, because the person who's going to get suddenly a screen that tells them, hey, we need you to do one more thing to verify it's you. It's not a sophisticated user like you or me. These are people who maybe only just started using the internet several months ago, and suddenly we're putting a bunch of friction in front of them. So that becomes a really important part of how, especially the integrity team thinks about sort of doing this job. Yeah. The adversaries that we're up
more sort of sensitive there on the integrity side with the confluence of indeed not being able to just sort of black and white mark a user as legit or not. But
exactly. There's a lot of sort of the thing we have to get very good at is measuring true positives, false positives, understanding sort of what the trade-offs are. Again, you can turn things all the way up, but then you're going to put a lot of friction in front of a lot of people that are legitimately trying to use your product and have done nothing wrong. You can also take it the other way, and then obviously you're going to let a bunch of bad people in. And so the integrity team really has the expertise in sort of in a very data-driven way, finding how we calibrate that. And trying to find the optimum. There's no one right answer, there's no one right optimum, but at least having the methodology to go about that. The security team will come in when, for example, in the account takeover space, we will find the adversaries, they will try to find vulnerabilities in the product. They will try to find, little pathways that perhaps manage to bypass some of these checks because there was a different login screen built, for whatever reason. Or another area where we find a bunch of these things come together is through any support we provide. So we have an effort to improve how we're providing support to people, businesses that use our products. But of course, the flip side of providing support is it will get abused. These adversaries are very determined. And we really find any outlet we give people to appeal a decision, tell us we're wrong, try to get in contact with the customer support representatives in any of these areas where it's one of the adversarial areas like accounts or spam, we will almost by default be overwhelmed with adversaries who are trying to get around those systems. And it could be just, let's appeal everything. And it could be, they could actually try to have a very well-manufactured attempt at social engineering for our customer support reps and try to say, hey, I swear this was my account and this thing happened. And you get these stories and they're often real. Like I have friends who ran into an issue and couldn't get back into their account, and I feel for them and it's a bad experience. And, we're trying to improve these, but we always have to be on guard because sometimes the scammers are going to tell you the exact same story and it can be very convincing.
Right. And you sort of end up sort of falling into, sort of a trust element with an unknown entity on the other side, which is very, very hard.
Exactly.
And I guess what are, I know it's like a little bit hard to share when they're doing, but sort of through the years, maybe if they're a little bit outdated at this point, what are some kind of useful techniques, for I'm more thinking if I'm like a CISO of a newer, smaller, clearly sort of, social network or sort of similar user-generated content type platform, and I worry about abuse, I have this responsibility. What are some sort of good tips, good techniques that you would share?
One of the areas we've looked at a lot is contact points. So that means the email or phone number you use when you sign up. And what happens is people often don't pay enough attention to these, especially on a platform that's been around for many years. Maybe they signed up with an old college email or, some webmail that today no one really uses, or a phone number that's changed. And that means two things. One, in some of those cases, those contact points could be vulnerable, either because the person isn't paying attention, maybe the email address was even recycled by the provider. And we've seen cases where the adversaries will go and they'll try to register a fresh new account on one of these webmail providers, and it's available because the person really hasn't logged in for years. Yeah. And boom, they're in a recovery address for one of their accounts. Phone numbers, you have a similar thing with recycling that happens if a number hasn't been used for a while. But the other really hard part of this is if an account is compromised, what usually we would ask someone is, hey, we can send a reset password link to your contact point. And then what we find in some of these cases is it's hard to give support because the people say, oh, but I don't even have that number anymore. And that's an old email I don't have access to anymore. So it sort of really reduces the breadth of how someone can actually prove their identity. And that's where we may get into things like selfie captcha, where we ask someone to actually take a photo. We want to try compare and ensure that this is actually the person who's represented by the profile. But you can imagine in a lot of scenarios that becomes really hard, particularly when you have pages, you have Instagram accounts for pets, for example. It's going to be really hard to demonstrate, like, yes, this is Fido the dog. It's like, I don't know if we can do the right amount of recognition there. So these are the kind of things that are really challenging. So one thing we do a lot, and people will see this when they log into Facebook or Instagram, we'll have like a thing at the top of feed which says, is this still your phone number? Is this still your email? The reason we do that is because we want to know, like, if it's not, we really want that off the account. And if it is, we want to know, hey, if there's an issue, we can go and we can contact you.
Yeah, that's a great tip. So basically, if I'm sort of building these, make sure that you kind of keep that contact detail fresh, because at the end of the day, that would be your kind of first line of defense when
really
someone, is, potentially attempting to fake it. The easiest thing is, do you have access to that original secret? But if that's outdated, that's not as good. We oftentimes in this podcast talk about sort of developers and about sort of responsibility on the security side, on how a lot of the functionality, at the end of the day, sort of security impacting decisions happen at development time. It's a developer making the decision. How do you engage them? How does that translate to integrity, to safety? Like, is it the same? Like, is there in a Meta, like a developer somewhere across Meta building functionality? How much impact do they have on the work of the integrity team? If relevant, like, how do you kind of educate or inform them about doing right or wrong decisions?
It's definitely an important thing, because the single most important thing we need is, especially when a new product rolls out, for it to be wired up to our integrity system. That means people can report content, we can review content, we can run our detection on it. And if you think about Meta, which has a lot of these sort of different surfaces, you think about even just within Facebook, you have groups and pages and marketplace, and there's a lot of sort of sub-products, as it were, that are being built and teams are iterating on them. What we have is both technology and process to ensure that integrity is part of it. It actually starts with people. So the team I oversee is a central team, sort of the largest team that thinks about this. But we actually have this federated model where we have these satellite integrity teams that are embedded into the different product groups. So there's one in Facebook and in Instagram and in WhatsApp and so forth. Mm-hmm. And those teams essentially are sort of the integrators, and they sit and they think about, they're at the table when those teams are building their new products. They're able to make sure that we're thinking adversarially. Hey, how's this going to be used? What's a spammer going to do here? What would, certain categories of bad actors do with the surface? They also bring all of the different technology in and make sure that they're wiring everything up to the central team. Now, even the folks that are actually building the product itself, so not, in Instagram, not in the Instagram integrity team, they're also thinking about this. And we both give them technology, and I see my team's goal is making it easy for them to do the right thing. It's like quite as we think about a lot across different security
It's
areas.
very analogous to like how you think about it. This is both for security and for integrity, right? Yeah.
Exactly. So you're building a new place where someone can, let's say, upload a photo on whatever surface. You want it to be really easy for that photo to go through our detection, to give that photo a report button, to ensure that our content reviewers can see that photo if it's reported or if it's detected and make a decision. So you kind of need the back-end widgets, as it were, that enable review. And so we provide all of those components so that they don't need to work hard to do that. It's a matter of quite straightforward integration. And then finally, we have a process, which is we have an integrity review process, and products that launch actually go through a process and we evaluate them. We make sure that we've defined policies. If it's a kind of new product that needs its own unique kind of policies, that we're enforcing those policies, that we have the right kind of measurement, which is really important for the space, so that we know what's going on, that we have the right enforcement. And so essentially this process helps us know that we're building the right product. And the goal, again, as in security, is to be involved early on in the process so that you can help the design and sort of make sure that people we're thinking about this in a prudent way. And there's examples like when we built the Facebook dating product now several years ago, when people are contacting each other, they can't send photos. I mean, we could detect photos, pornography, and various kinds of abuse, but we actually chose as a product matter to just disable, let's keep it text, to help to sort of avoid that whole thing. And that's an example of sort of integrity thinking being baked in pretty high up.
Like a safe by design type concept. But
Exactly.
by the way, as a small kind of organizational curiosity here, like the description you talked about, like in the business unit, sounds like the BISOs, like the sort of the business unit, sort of security officers. Where does integrity and security meet? Is it only at the sort of at the top, in your organization, or in the different business units, they also roll up sort of security and integrity roll up into a single individual?
It varies. Different teams have slightly different structure in how they operate, but generally it's in a similar place because those are people who have that mindset, they have the kind of training, again, it's a similar pattern of how they work with the product team. So they're typically packaged fairly close together, I would say.
Depends on the. Let me kind of transition a little bit, although you kind of mentioned AI, and talk a little bit about that, and maybe just before we shift into AI security or sort of talk about, the new technology security, you mentioned AI as a good tool to sort of combat, issues or sort of abuse on the integrity. At the same time, I know there's all this conversation around the value of AI and filtering and kind of proactive filtering versus the privacy first kind of lens that is also perceived as a safety or an integrity or security kind of practice on it. How do you think about that balance of sort of seeing more content so you can filter more content versus seeing less content so, you're sort of not in the data?
It's a really important one that, I mean, not just we, honestly, like the world struggles with anything, right? It's like, I mean, we are moving towards encryption in Messenger. WhatsApp is encrypted, which means there's less ways to scan things. And on the one hand, you could think, look, from an integrity perspective, might just want to scan everything. But really, if you think about this, first of all, that privacy is sort of a first principle for these products. Like people need to be able to communicate in a way that's no one is there.
Yeah,
exactly. And we talk about WhatsApp as it's kind of a digital living room. You want to be able to have a conversation. It's completely private. But what you want is to then think about what are within a private space, the right ways to give those capabilities. So the things we think about are, for example, user reporting becomes important because if someone's on the receiving end of some kind of abuse, you want to make sure that they're able to submit it. And of course, they've seen that abuse, they're able to share that with us so that we can investigate. Mm-hmm. You also think about behavioral things, and we see this on, for example, spam on WhatsApp. We're able to see through behavioral patterns, even without seeing anything in the content, that something here is, the volumes or the patterns are not where they need to be.
Of that, of like a group that gets created with, exactly. 100 people invited in one go.
A lot of the levers also become those sort of upstream things we could do in the product and ensure that we understand how we give people information, how we give people more levers. Like you can leave a group and say, hey, don't add me again. Or you see a message on WhatsApp that's been forwarded multiple times, you see a little double arrow that says frequently forwarded. those are little cues that sort of help in an integrated product experience to enhance some of the sort of integrity features there. It has to be about empowering people. But ultimately, we know this privacy is a safety thing because, ultimately these people who are at risk get their phones taken or their messages intercepted. And so making sure that we are really honest to what end-to-end encryption promises is just so important.
I think it's interesting to kind of echo that sort of lens of empowerment, both across, on one hand, before you were sort of commenting on how your job is to sort of make it easy for developers to do the right thing, it's sort of also true for users. Okay. And I guess to an extent, the more power you give anyone, in this case, a user, because you've opted for a privacy first platform, or a developer who is clearly, entrusted with writing significant functionality that affects these billions of people, you have to make it easier for them to do the right thing. Yeah. Let's sort of shift gears a little bit. This is probably a topic we can talk for hours on, but I want to tap into another sort of knowledge domain, that you have a bit of unique view to it. This sort of realm of securing cutting edge technologies. And I'm kind of melding in together here two things which are not really related, I think, which are AI and metaverse, just sort of thinking about both as things that you'd sort of need to get a grasp on ahead of much of the world. Maybe let's sort of start with AI, just because I think more people are grappling with that. When you think about AI security, first of all, is like, how do you even approach this problem? Like, unlike many others, there isn't really as much existing best practices that you can follow and you can implement. When you think about, AI security, or really metaverse security in this context, how do you approach knowing what to do? How do you organizationally structure it? How do you tackle that?
The first thing is it actually leans on that same structure and same process I talked about, where in our metaverse team, for example, there's a metaverse integrity team. It thinks about basically end to end. What are the policies that we want to have? What are the systems we need to build? Where can we lean on the central systems? Where do we need to build unique things for what is a unique, different, synchronous experience, also with certain privacy expectations, and making sure we're honoring that. It's really important to have these discussions early so that we think about these things and to do sort of the adversary thinking to figure out where is this going to be abused? What are the different kinds of things? Where do we want to draw lines? Where are people, maybe going to have offensive things that we don't like, but it's their right to do so. And when is, look, this is where we draw a line. And we'd like some ability to understand and enforce policies. Where do you want to empower users? Where do you want to empower creators who are building worlds, for example, and say, look, that they get to set the rules because it's sort of their space? And what are the areas where we need to take responsibility centrally and say, look, these are certain red lines that you can't cross no matter what, even a creator, thinks this is appropriate behavior. And so you have things that are sort of all across those kind of dimensions. But a lot of it comes back to that same empowerment point you made earlier, because if you think about a synchronous experience like in Horizons, which is our metaverse sort of applications, being in that world, an approach of content filtering, kind of like you have on a medium such as Facebook or Instagram with posts or stories, might not be applicable because people are speaking sort of live, much as we are now. Is it appropriate for that filtering to happen in real time? Probably not the right mechanism, but much more about empowering. And so we will do things like having a personal boundary. If someone feels harassed, they basically can do something you can't do in the real world, which is draw a circle around them.
Erect a barrier. Yeah,
exactly. No one is coming in here. This is my space. You can turn on a feature that, for example, garbles everyone's audio except your friends. So that I just don't want to hear all those other people that are out there. I only want to be here interacting with friends. So it's examples of sort of integrity features that are product features, actually, that help to empower people, give them choice, give them the ability to control their experience, and is probably the more appropriate way for us to be thinking about some of these things, because again, the sort of traditional concept of content moderation might not apply in something that kind of synchronous conversation.
Do you think about hiring profile when you think about individuals on it? Does that make that team look different in terms of sort of makeup and skills? I mean, versus maybe the content moderation teams or sort of things that are a little bit more of a paved path, although granted, maybe at the scale of Meta, there's elements that are unique there as well, but still they're a little bit less abstract than sort of the metaverse world, for instance.
We have a bunch of internal mobility, people who've moved around between these teams, and you'll typically find, someone who is maybe on one of the central teams or helped build Instagram's integrity, now thinking about things on the metaverse or on some, other new area. But we'll also hire new people who've, worked in the space. And I generally have found, this is true across integrity, especially as an area which is relatively new in the industry, really strong generalists are able to take sort of an adversarial approach and think about the bad use cases, who are very analytical, very structured thinkers, and are very principled, because that really matters, to make sure that they can articulate what is the policy, where do you draw the lines, where do you not want to actually enforce that. I've found a lot of that talent can come from people who haven't necessarily worked on these kind of areas specifically, but are able to come in and do amazing things on both the central integrity team and on the broader set of integrity teams as they sort of tackle some of these issues.
That makes a lot of sense. And I'm slightly curious whether security profiles fit that bill. They're generalists and they're doing it, but is there so much compliance baggage, or is there too much almost like negativity sometimes? Like, do you find sort of people coming from the InfoSec side to sort of be a good foundation, to come into integrity?
Some of them, definitely. There's definitely a mix. And originally these teams actually, or at least parts of them, were together back in sort of even before my time working on the area, and they sort of gravitated apart due to a bunch of organizational reasons and ended up coming back together. So there are a fair amount of people who actually worked on the crossover between both. And I think, like on every team, you want a diverse set of people who have had different kinds of experiences, worked at different companies, also seen different things in life, and I can understand what different people are trying to do with technology, what kind of issues they're dealing with in their population or their communities, and how that manifests on the platform, so they can bring that perspective. But you're definitely going to have people who are sort of pulling in different directions, and the goal of a team is to try to create a cohesive plan and try to understand all of those different perspectives and try to bring a plan and create the product and the right solutions and the right policies and the right enforcement to be able to account for so many of those different issues.
So if we continue from there, like you have a team, they're sort of divided. The team that works on metaverse, or maybe even subset, within that, Horizons, is focused on that problem domain. So they get to focus and kind of pave the path on it. But, Meta is also a platform for a lot of other developers of, metaverse applications, of sort of, VR applications on it. Basically, I think like very few people know what to even answer when they say, what are potential security threats that you should consider when you are building a metaverse application? I guess maybe one is like to actually literally ask you that question, when you sort of think about the top 1, 2, 3 things that people should think about. And second is, when you institutionalize this and you talk about these platform developers, do you build some sort of guidance, something like, how do you use your learnings to sort of educate the ecosystem?
Yeah, the goal is to provide guidance, SDKs, libraries, et cetera, for developers so that they can ultimately create the right experiences, but we can help them do a bunch of it and give them the right sort of umbrella of, these are our expectations. And if you think about it, it's not that different from, you're building an app on Android, iPhone. The platform has a certain set of expectations of, you're going to do some content moderation. We have some baseline expectations. They don't get into the nitty gritty because it's not reasonable for a platform to be very prescriptive down to the individual sort of policy line, but you want to define the broad strokes. So we have sort of the broad values or principles of what we expect, the kind of conduct on a platform where we have developers that are coming in that are building their own apps for, a Quest headset or what may be. And we want to give them SDKs to help them do the work, because ultimately, a developer sitting down and they're trying to build the best game in the world or an amazing interactive experience. And we want to make sure that we're empowering them and helping them integrate these kind of capabilities, but also we don't want to be the ones that are setting the discrete rules in each and every app, because that is unsustainable and it's unreasonable for developers who are trying to create their own space and their own flavors. And, each app has its own kind of feel and different things that they want to make sure that are happening inside the app. So we provide that sort of the guidance and the SDKs to essentially help them accomplish that.
Yeah, it's interesting how like a lot of these answers end up sort of revolving around this sort of same path, which is you've got a central team, they relate, the integrity and the security capabilities, but at the end of the day, you're trying to create and package, sometimes in guidance, sometimes in software, a set of practices, a set of behaviors that have been scrutinized to be secure, to be, ethical, to be safe. And then you try to propagate those across your developers, you propagate those to users. Users is clearly a little bit more narrow a path, and then to sort of softer to developers of applications on top of your platform. And I guess the more you opt, it sounds like the paved road approach. The more you kind of opt onto the paved road, the less of these concerns you need to have as a developer in or out of Meta, the more you're kind of bushwhacking your way kind of off to the side, the more you need to take on kind of those considerations yourself.
I think that's right. And I mean, this is a general pattern one would expect from any, security team, and this applies to integrity. You want to sort of set the rules or aspirations or conditions, but then also help people meet them. And that's, I think, really important for those to happen together so that you're actually empowering, whether it's engineers at the company, whether it's developers outside the company, whether it's creators who are trying to, create a world or create spaces, making sure that you're helping them do these things, but giving, some sort of framework for them to think about these things. But you want to make sure ultimately you're letting them experience this amazing new thing that you've created and create things that we haven't thought of. I mean, the goal is to make sure that people are innovating. And I think it's going to be hard for people to innovate if your rules are so onerous. It's not about the rules. The rules are, while you do that, here's how you can be a responsible actor. Here's things we're worried about. Here's things, there's expectations the world has as you build these. And hey, here's ways to help you do that and help you fulfill those obligations in the most effective way.
Yeah, I guess kind of combining a little bit those sort of two worlds. We talked about sort of, integrity and purity, and we talked about this sort of this more metaverse and more kind of murky space. But what do you do around tech for the new space? What do you do around, detecting that something went wrong in the new reality, that someone's tampering with your AI kind of algorithm, that someone's, indeed performing some sort of social engineering scheme, within the metaverse? Do you have to build all of those yourself? Is there a sort of nascent startup scene designed? I guess there isn't. Is there enough of a market for that at the moment? How do you think about detection and about building those tools? Do you build them all in-house?
I think probably almost all of the stuff is in-house. Just the sheer scale and the kind of requirements we have for so many of our platforms, it makes it very hard to integrate with outside technology. To me, one of the things that is at the heart of so much of this work is measurement. It is ensuring that we are, and integrity, this is such a big part of what we do, is we define the policies and then we first measure ourselves against them. How much bad content are people actually seeing? How much is getting through? And then that helps us understand where we need to make progress on enforcement, whether there are changes in the ecosystem, whether an adversary is trying something and perhaps breaking through some defenses, and we need to go back and make sure that we're updating what we do to react to that.
This measurement sort of focuses on user reports, or what's the sort of the primary measurement? I mean, you have to measure against something.
On integrity, for example, one of the most important metrics we have is a metric we call prevalence, which is how much, and think about this in the context of something like a Facebook or an Instagram, how much content that violates our policies actually shows up on someone's screen at the end of the day. So what we do is we take a sample of content that's viewed, and then we send that for labeling by our content reviewers. And then we're able to see, there is something and we publish these metrics now on a quarterly basis. So it's something like 0.0 something percent of content that is viewed violates for hate speech or pornography, for example. And by looking at those trends, we're able to see, is the enforcement working? Because why would someone see it? It means either we didn't catch it or we caught it, but too late. And it took time, and perhaps took a few minutes or a few hours for a reviewer to get to it because it was something that AI couldn't make that decision. And therefore, in the meantime, people may have seen that post. And so we use that measurement to help us understand exactly the direction and where there are changes in the ecosystem. And we will see adversarial evolution. We see things like in areas of pornography, for example, which has some overlap with spam, we will see spammers iterating on getting as close as they can to the line of where our pornography detection kicks in, but still something that's sort of suggestive, and try to post that kind of content. And then, so understanding how they're doing that, how they're manipulating it, whether they're trying different surfaces to see if we have different defenses that maybe run at different pace across different surfaces. Those are all the kinds of things that there's adversaries constantly trying to test and push against our systems. And so we have to be very, very alert and make sure that we're reacting to those kind of things.
Indeed. I think we're sort of running out of time here. There's so much to still kind of unpack here. Maybe if I can ask for one kind of last nugget of wisdom, if you're talking to, a security leader, security and integrity leader, at a nascent startup, you've already given a bunch of tips. What's going to more bit of advice you'd sort of give them to say, make sure to be mindful of as they embark on the journey?
Wow. Yeah, that is it's probably a longer question than a few minutes, but I'll try anyway. I think one of the key things is that it's a multidisciplinary endeavor. It's not just an engineering problem. We have three disciplines that work on the integrity work in particular, which are the engineering teams, the policy teams, and the operations teams. So if you think about it, each of these, we always have to be working in concert, because the policies you define end up having to be translated by the operations team to guidance for content reviewers, by the engineering team to AI systems, or actually even the tools that those content reviewers use. Nothing can happen in a vacuum, because what you don't want to write a policy that you can't enforce. And so these teams are really deeply embedded. And one of the things that I think was the most important that we did is, not only do I spend time, because I've historically focused mostly on the engineering side, with my counterparts from those disciplines, but we also propagate that down. So an individual engineering manager or product manager working on, let's say, hate speech will partner very closely with the policy manager for hate speech and with the operations manager for hate speech. And that sort of triumvirate will work together and ensure that we're constantly working in lockstep as we evolve the policy, as we build the systems, as we train the reviewers, because you have to have a tight feedback loop across those. So I think that'd probably be like the first thing I would do, is make sure you're really thinking about these things as that sort of interdisciplinary effort.
Yeah, that's a great bit of advice, and totally not obvious, and probably especially for someone coming from sort of the tech side of the fence to do it. So that is superb advice. Guy, thanks again for coming onto the show, for helping us, and in general, for all the great work you do to try and keep the social world safe. And by virtue of that, it's a big part of our entire world here. So thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting me.
And thanks everybody for tuning back in, and I hope you join us for the next one.
Thank you for listening to The Secure Developer. You will find other episodes and full transcripts on devseccon.com. We hope you enjoyed the episode, and don't forget to leave us a review on Apple iTunes or Spotify, and share the episode with others who may enjoy it and gain value from it. If you would like to recommend a guest or topic, or share some feedback, you can find us on Twitter at devseccon and LinkedIn at The Secure Developer. See you in the next episode.